Wonderful. I think we are recording. There we go. I am going to share the screen quickly so I can share the SCA harassment and bullying policy. The SCA prohibits harassment and bullying of all individual groups and members. Participants engaging in this behavior are subject to appropriate sanctions. If you are subject to harassment, please notify Seneschal, President of the SCA, or your Kingdom's Board Ombudsman. And I'm going to also put this slide in the chat as well, so everyone has access to it. And then with that, I'm going to leave it to our instructor.
All right. Good evening and welcome to the Ministry of Arts and Sciences class in the Research and Performance Rubrics. A couple of notes for tonight. If you don't have your, actually I see all of you are muted, so you're already all pros. If you would like to have your camera off, or if you don't want to have risk of your image popping up in the Zoom, go ahead and turn off your camera. Otherwise, you can just set your camera to speaker view so that we can get a good rendering. And I believe, Lissa, since you initiated the chat, you must be in speaker view. The recording, you must be in speaker view. All right, we covered the SCA harassment policy. And today we're going to talk about the two rubrics we've never talked about in a class like this before, which are our research rubric and our performance rubrics. The purpose of this class is to clarify any questions about calibrating the judging in the competitions at the kingdom level. The rubrics can be used at competitions in competitions at other levels, but primarily at the Ministry of Arts and Science, we handle those kingdom levels, like the Crown's A&S competition. So this class is for artisans who are thinking of entering a kingdom level competition, for artisans looking for ideas, inspiration, or even a metric to apply to their projects, and of course for judges of these competitions, so that you can get familiarized with how these rubrics are set up, get into the details of what it means, what some of this language means, and of course just become familiar with where the nuances of the document documents are. Like anything else, the language has been looked at and perfected and put through a lot of different editing and manipulation so that it is as good as it can be, but they are documents, and the process of actually judging an entry or even creating an entry is a very human, more nuanced thing. So as a result, there's a little bit of wiggle that we like to calibrate for in this process. As you know, if you've ever judged in the SCA, it can be very difficult, even with a rubric, because decisions must be made about where what is being presented falls, which might not be cut and dried. And we'll have a couple of situations we'll encounter today in our examples that will allow us to explore that a little further. The rubrics on their own do a great deal to create a framework for how the work will be judged, but these calibration classes can help focus us and focus the tool itself in order to create better clarity for the judges and entrants in competition. The goal of the East Kingdom rubrics is to create a more standardized format for how our kingdom level A&S competitions are adjudicated. And I talked already about other competitions who may be able to use that, but tonight we're focusing just on research and performance. There was already a class in the general rubric on October 9th taught by Mr. Selena Hilton, and she went over the documents that had previously been judged over the last season in this class. There will be another session in general rubrics, and I don't remember the date offhand, but we will put that in the chat or announce it at the end. Which will have new documentation, new projects that we will be putting through the general rubric just to freshen our understanding with new data points. All right. So the research rubric specifically weighs research entries, and research projects are works that compile data and information to make some sort of argument, hopefully a strong argument. Ideally, we're looking for a strong thesis and an equally strong defense of that thesis. In terms of performance as arts and science, we're not looking at how entertaining or enjoyable a performance is alone, although that is part of it. Instead, we are looking for where the performance fits within a historical context. What is the act of performance creation? ANS performance is specifically not a bardic performance, and it has different parameters for judgment, which we will cover today as well. Now, there is some crossover in the overall structure of all of our rubrics, so it is worth watching the general rubrics class and trying to absorb that as well, even if you're certain that you're going to present research or performance, just so that you have some sort of context for what the entire process is. And I think looking at how some of the other rubrics come together actually clarifies some points that might feel a little bit nebulous when you look at them for the first time in isolation in just one of the rubrics. So I do invite you to either go back to the October 9th YouTube selection. I'll put that link in the chat in a little bit, or make sure that you're present at the new rubrics class that will be happening soon. All right, so I believe the handout is in the chat. Is that correct, Lisa, for today? Have we put that in there yet?
Not yet, but I can try to do that really quickly unless you have it up.
I can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Just need to grab the link, bring it here in the chat. So the document I just put in the chat is our handout for today, and it kind of gives you an outline for how we're going to travel through this experience together. We have gotten through our introduction, the purpose and the goals of our rubrics, and now we're going to go through the first of the rubrics on our hit parade, which is the Research Rubric. Oh, sorry. That's a little silly. I will take care of that. Thank you, Amelie. So maybe I need to do this a little differently. Do you know if I can just save this and get it to go? Could you take a moment to do that?
Yeah, if you want to keep talking, I can try to
do that.
Play with it.
I will keep talking and I will let you save me from my technologically challenged self. So we will get that working so you guys can look at it. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the actual research rubric. So the research rubrics, actually all of the rubrics are available at the moas.eastkingdom.org website. So if you are looking for information about, let's say, Crown's ANS this particular year, there's tons of information on the originating page. And among those things, we have our rubric documents. It's actually listed as scoring and rubrics. And our research rubric, which I'm going to put in the chat right now from the link. Thank you. It looks like that was. Can somebody test the document? So I've just connected the research rubric, and hopefully we can read the handout.
And we'll also, in the recording, put these in the description so the links will be available.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for checking. All right, so the research rubric is actually one of the shorter rubrics. It's divided into purpose, investigation, presentation, and sources. And we'll get into each of those subcategories, but I want to call your attention to this opening page. And this opening page is the same across the rubrics. It is how we our guidelines for the use of the rubric, and importantly, I want to call your attention to the box that says to provide a consistent judging experience for all entrants. reading the rubric from, and to kind of give us an overview of how we're going to read this rubric, we're going to read the rubric from left to right, and we're going to apply the rubric categories as written while judging each entry. There are 4 categories, but each category has multiple elements. We're going to use the check boxes to indicate at what level an entrant has met each of the elements of a category, and judges can offer comments, where relevant, in the boxes under each rubric category during judging. After judging, please write summary comments and suggestions in the space provided at the end of the rubric. Scores for a category will be an average of the scores of each element in that category. But excitingly, you don't need to do that math. You just grade the category that you're in. The document is provided to the judging table, and they will do the math for you. And then our last point is, please note that a few categories are also weighted so that they are worth more than other categories. For example, in this particular rubric, when you look at investigation, in the little box here, the average score is going to be multiplied by 3, because in this particular rubric, investigation is a very weighted part of the project. It's where we want to give most of the points. So that's just something to note, that not every section is weighted in exactly the same way. All right. So let us get into it. So if we go into purpose in the research rubric, the research rubric is the only one of the rubrics that asks you to defend, that is asked to defend its purpose. We want to see specifically a thesis, an argument, and how you intend to prove said argument. Within this category, we also talk about historical and cultural context and the practical significance to this purpose within the bounds of our pre-17th century game. A research project is specifically not a summary of the research of others, but should seek to create some new knowledge based on the evidence you have provided. So if you think about what makes a research paper different than some research that you've done for another project, it's that aspect of new knowledge being created. And of course, how you defend that new knowledge that you are creating. So in purpose, you're going to get the 2 categories of the goals of the work and the cultural and historical context of the work. And these categories are numbered from 1 to 5, but then after the end of the row, after this very firm double block, we have a 6. And 6 is where you can consider the extra special bonus sauce of the rubrics. So our grading is, our scoring is really on a scale of 1 through 5, with the 6 being something exceptional, additional, above and beyond. So that very firm, bold line is almost a wall that has to be jumped in order for that 6 to be achieved. So when we look at the two things under purpose, a 1 would be the goals of the work are hard to determine, are unclear and confusing. And then we get clearer, and then we maybe are consistent but simplistic. By the time we're at 4, we're beginning to make arguments and to prove a point, maybe draw some conclusions. At 5, those goals are sophisticated, maybe complex. The focus on making a compelling argument is super clear. We're drawing conclusions, we're making conjectures. That 5 is kind of at the heart of really exciting research. To jump to a 6, those goals have to become ambitious. They have to focus on the desire to create new information, to delve a little deeper, to develop new confusions, or to put new information into the context of relevance in practice in the SCA. So not just within the personal practice, maybe of the artisan, but looking forward and adding something new to the society, perhaps. Cultural context and historical significance has that same scale as it's moving from it's hard to determine what this significance is, or perhaps it's getting clearer. By 3, the information about cultural context and historical significance is articulated, but maybe only briefly or weakly. By 4, you're already creating something that's significant, it's well-rounded. At 5, it's crystal clear, understandable in detail. And to jump to a 6, the full significance and value of the information created is strongly articulated and thoroughly supported. So each of your points has some background. So again, that jump between a 5 or a 6 is a little bit of a chasm. And Lissa has a comment here.
So one thing for everyone to think about, when you talked about the idea of new information being created, the one thing I want to stress is that unlike somebody who is doing a thesis for school, we're not expecting you, the artisan, to have come up with a new theory or a new idea. What we're expecting is for you to take information from other sources and to put it together into a convincing argument. What may happen is that it may have a particular relevance for our use in the SCA and how we use it. It doesn't have to, but I just want to be clear that we're not worried about creating new information, but we are very much worried about creating an argument and supporting it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not trying to take leaps into the academic world outside of the SCA. We're trying to be cool and exciting within our world of the SCA. All right, so then when we move to investigation, then we start thinking about what types of information are presented in defense of the argument. What is the quality of the data that's measured? How convincing is the body of evidence? What are the next level progressions of the project, if any? And importantly, this doesn't mean that you necessarily are going to take those new next steps into the project. It just means that you could imagine where it might go further, where this argument could take someone, what projects might derive from this project that you've put forward. And again, we're scaled from 1 to 5, with 1s being really there's not much there. 2s being, okay, I sort of see it, but it's not really consistent. 3s, it's reliable and there's some effort being made. We see where there could be some effort there. By 4, things are coherent. There's a little bit more of a through line. We're feeling like there's substance there. And at 5, we're seeing that there is a solid body of evidence, that there's a chain of logic that we can follow with some precision. And the third point in the investigation section, which has gone over to the next page, is that point about further avenues of exploration. It could be that you've done your research and you've delved as deep as you're going to go, and you have no intention of doing anything further. But you could still make some extension to get more points in this area, making some extension towards where could somebody else take this research, what projects might derive from this research, where in your Imagineering could it go, not necessarily where you're going to take it. You might be done. You might have researched everything and you are complete. But we still would like to know, okay, so someone in 2 years who picks up this research, where will they take it if it's fleshed in that way? Ideally, all of this fun stuff we do enriches us, but also enriches the society in some greater way. So that's where that fun area can go. And it's a good place to try to, if you're trying to figure out how to maximize those investigated points, which are weighted so heavily on this point, on this particular rubric, that might be a place where you could explore what can be explored. Moving on to presentation. Presentation is very interesting in research because it's really about, can I understand the research that's been done? How clear is this? How does it flow? And we're not talking about grammar, and we're not talking about whether it's academic writing. We're talking about, do I understand what's been said? How do we go from one point to another? am I able to keep sight of the argument as I'm navigating these new points of facts that have been put in there? And do I still only have one argument, or have we kind of gone into another land? All of those things that can sometimes happen in research, but for the purpose of this particular rubric, we're trying to see if the presentation functions as something that keeps on target with the goal of presenting a thesis and defending it. So, and I am going to very carefully again stress that it's not grammar, and it's not how well you are, how well versed you are in language and vocabulary. It's not about whether you're an exceptional writer who inspires people with your turn of phrase. That is all beautiful, but that isn't necessary in order to score well in the presentation. It's how clear can you be about what it is that you are trying to do, so that you can bring your judges and anybody else who comes to read your research on the journey with you from what you believe at the beginning through your research to your ultimate conclusion. So if you can take people from that starting point to the end, you succeed at your presentation. And then, of course, sources. The sources are divided into variety of sources, quality of sources, and the applicability and authority of those sources that are used in order to provide the evidence and the data within your research project. These sources should be a combination of direct and analytical sources. These are things that used to be referred to as primary or tertiary, actually probably still are in some circles, primary, secondary, tertiary sources. Those are the types of things, for example, in fiber arts, a primary source could be an extant garment, or a bug find, or something where we have the actual fiber. And a secondary source could be somebody has analyzed that, they actually got to touch it, and they have given us measurements and all of those neat things. A secondary source could also be somebody got to see those things, but maybe they're not a fiber artist, but they've done some level analysis that gives us more insight and information about this primary source. And then a tertiary source could be somebody who's then revisiting that information and synthesizing it in maybe a new and exciting way, or just wording it in a way that makes it more understandable for people who aren't, fiber artists or scientists that are archaeologists or any number of things. So we divide them into direct and analytical sources for our purposes here in the SEA, just as a rule of thumb. So as we're getting to look at all of these fun things, all of these sources, the things that you want to look at is how many different types of sources do you have? What type of journey have you been looking at? Are you all direct sources? Is there any analysis? And if so, is it your analysis, or have experts in the field actually made some analysis? Importantly, here in the SEA, we have lots of artisans doing research and publishing their findings on their blogs and on their YouTube channels and all over the place, and they're teaching classes and they're going up on YouTube. 2020 has just been an explosion of what is available to us. But those things that are provided to us by other artisans in the SEA aren't necessarily good analytical sources for us. They could be, it's possible. They're certainly not primary sources for us. So as we're looking at research, we're trying to think of, okay, what is it that is the closest I can get to the thing? What is it that these experts in the field have said about this thing? Ibrahim has just made this incredibly wonderful point that I'm going to say out loud. Analytical sources don't, using an analytical source doesn't mean you agree with the source. Your argument could be, you know what, I don't agree, and this is why. And have your points that can create an argument in that way. So as we're looking at these things, what we're trying to do is, what is the best knowledge? What brings what brings you in this moment and someone else who might approach this work the best chance at achieving the cleanest, clearest knowledge about this particular thing? I think something that happens as artisans that is a wonderful thing and that should be in your research paper is your opinion, your conjectures, the way your mind works. So if you're using as an analytical source something that another artisan has done, you have to know that that is also part of their analysis, their opinion, their thoughts, the way their mind works. And that might have drifted far afield from the original source document. So it's just something to do. I'm not saying don't ever quote an artisan from the SCA. As a matter of fact, if you have looked extensively at somebody's work, please, please, please say, I looked at this. And then please, please, please go and find some primary and academic or at least closer to source analytical findings as well. So if you're using works of other artisans, by all means, name them so that we can at least know where your thinking came from. We'll find a little bit later a certain artisan who used knowledge in their defense that they did not cite. There's a word for that, and it's not a nice one. So we're going to keep on moving through, though. So we're going to get through, and we're going to go through two specific practice pieces. We're going to grade them using the research rubric just to get our feet wet. In the handout, which hopefully everybody has now, the handout should have two links to documentation. We have our first example is called Symmetrical versus Asymmetrical Offset Lacing on Front-Laced Women's Gowns in Western Europe, 1450s to 1550s. The submitter is Mr. Selena Hilton, and the link is attached. The second example is called Socks from Post-Roman Egypt, and the submitter is Ibrahim, whose titles I don't have here. My apologies. And the link is also attached. So we're going to look at each of these through each of the categories. And for each of them, it's a lot to read the documentation of a project on the fly, especially when it comes to research. So we've excerpted little paragraphs to kind of help us along the way as you're looking at the documentation. So under purpose, we excised a paragraph from Mr. Selena's paper that says, this paper looks at the frequency of two methods of placing lacing holes on women's front lace gowns, symmetrical and asymmetrical, as seen in the paintings in Western Europe from the 1450s to the 1550s, and argues that the commonly held belief that asymmetrical lacing is the most documentable option is not supported by an examination of the paintings from the period. Popular historic clothing blogs and websites such as Festive Attire frequently state that asymmetrical placement is generally the most historically accurate option for all of the medieval and Renaissance eras across Western Europe. However, an analysis of 101 paintings found through searching multiple museum catalogs, approximately 5,000 images initially looked at, which showed visible lacing on the front of women's gowns, found that examples of symmetrical lacing were more common in many decades than asymmetrical lacing, and made up 61.3% of the total examples found across the 1450s and 1550s. Of the 101 images examined in detail, 62 showed symmetrical lacing, 23 showed asymmetrical, and the remaining 16 were unclear. This shows that in paintings, symmetrical lacing is substantially more common than asymmetrical for much of that time frame, and disproves the general statement that asymmetrical lacing is universally more period appropriate than symmetrical lacing for the entire medieval Renaissance period in Western Europe. In discussion with this artisan, asked to give us a little bit more about what their thesis might be, the artisan stated that their primary purpose was to address the bias in support of spiral lacing to the exclusion of those historically acceptable, other historical acceptable styles of lacing. The intended scope for this project was very narrow. So if we go to our handy dandy rubric, under purpose, where do we think that fits? And you can go ahead and put it into comments if you would like to, and just give us a little bit of an overview of what your thoughts might be. Anybody have an idea? So we have a 4 coming in. Anyone else? Okay, we got another 4. We got the 4s all around. All right. And survey said, sorry, I lost my place on my page, which is why suddenly I'm running around like a crazy person. Mental note, never teach a class with too many windows open. You'll never find where you're supposed to be. Survey said we all got a 4. The argument itself was very clear, but it was not particularly complex. So under the second portion of that, under purpose, the cultural context or historical or practical significance of the information. Where do you think we see that? Any ideas? Do we think that there is no information? Is it hard to determine or unclear? Or is there an inconsistent clarity? Is it articulated but only weakly or briefly? Okay, we see 4s coming through on that. And 1 5 for that second element. Got a 4 for the second element. Interestingly, the judges were a little harsher on this entry. We came up with a 3, which is the cultural context or historical or practical significance of the information is articulated, but only weakly or briefly. And the only reason this scored a 3 is because the judges, the specific dates were given, but not any specifics aside from that. What location are we talking about? What is is there actually a specific context about, is there a functional relationship there? We'll talk about that a little bit later in this research project. We had questions that were not clear, but related to a historical and cultural context for the item. So we actually put that as a 3 because we felt that that wasn't firmly articulated in the description of the paper.
And then one thing to think about when we're actually judging, we usually look and hope that judges are within 1 point of each other, because then you can have a discussion and it's usually easy to come to some agreement. So if one judge was at a 3, another was at a 4, you talk about it, and probably one person would convince the other one to sort of go with their thoughts on the idea. If we're a little bit more separated than that, it becomes a little bit more difficult, and judges can feel free to pull somebody from the MOAS office in who's a little more familiar with the rubric to help out there.
Absolutely. And I think even sometimes as an artisan, if you're using the rubric as a way in which to prepare your work, sometimes it can become a little fuzzy. Well, am I articulating this clearly? Do I need more here? It's clear to me, but perhaps it's not clear in a greater context. We have the ability to open that up for consultation so that someone can actually help you with those questions, as long as you try to get that assistance well in advance of the actual competition.
And I think for this one was part of the reason that we scored it a little harsher, because it didn't really talk about why this was important or significant, other than the fact that the author wanted to disprove something that people were saying. Sort of why does it matter that one was used and not the other?
Exactly. All right, moving on to our second example. Does anybody have any questions about that scoring for purpose for the first example? Excellent. So moving on to the second example, our excerpt was, in order to understand the socks from Egypt, it is necessary to discuss briefly the types of shoes worn in this period. Figure 1 from a group called Brent, which I did not include in your handout, but is in the original documentation if you follow the link, shows the types of shoes common in the Roman Empire. In addition to these characteristically Roman styles, a more typically Byzantine style is also found in Egypt during this period, usually described as a slipper. See photo on page 24, again, in your link. The Metropolitan Museum of Art indicates that written evidence suggests that sandals, solé, were worn by government officials, slippers by monks and clergy, and boots by soldiers and laborers. The poorest members of society would have gone barefoot. Many varieties of socks can be worn with the carbatine, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing this correctly, calige, and slippers. However, due to the presence of a leather thong between the first and second toes, similar to modern flip-flops, solé, if worn with socks, required a specially made sock with separate compartments for the first toe and the minor toes. There are two main types of surviving socks from the Roman Empire, including from Roman Egypt and from the post-Roman Egypt, socks made from woolen cloth and socks made with the nail-bending technique. My focus here is on the socks made with nail-bending. These can be further divided into those employing the Coptic stitch, also referred to as Coptic knitting, cross-looping, and terim stitch, and those employing more complex nail-bending structures. So from that excerpt, or from, if you are a fast reader, you might have gone over to the documentation and gleaned a little bit more. Let's see what we think about the purpose. Where do we think this might have fallen? Some coming in. We have A3. Anybody else have some thoughts? Correct, mostly discussing summary. 3. I'll take the suspense out of it. We also had it as a 3. We had no clear thesis for this research, and it did seem to us more like a summary of findings. There was, over the course of this particular introduction, a lot of implication of what more there could be, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I want to know what you think about the cultural and historical significance before we get there. Any thoughts about that second part of the purpose? Higher than 3? Cultural connection, 4, 5, 4. Interestingly, on the day we judged it, we had this as a 3, but I got to speak to the artisan today. So when we were looking at it, the overall quality of the research had us constantly searching for a thesis, and this searching for a thesis made us miss some cultural context. After speaking with the artisan today, if we had gotten to, as a core of judges, speak to the artisan, that would have been a 4.
What information was the artisan able to add that helped push that up?
So the artisan was asked about specific goals for this project, and we discovered today, well, me discovered today that this was meant to be supplemental documentation to an object creation, not specifically research. We also discovered that a lot of the research that was putting forward was to create kind of this basis, this core line for all of the variants. Once we were able to talk to the artisan about all of the variants and that context as it was coming in, it became completely clear where this research was going. And we no longer had questions about whether the artisan understood historical context or cultural context for the item. Obviously, that was completely clear. It was actually sort of clear from the documentation, but what happens a lot of times when you don't find a clear thesis is that it muddies the beginning of the research.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, our experience as a judging corps.
The other thing I think this can also illustrate is that a research paper is different than the backup documentation for a physically created article, that more would have to be done to turn that type of background research into a research paper of its own. And a lot of that really does lie with the purpose and argument.
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things and the reason that this particular document was requested of the submitter is that a lot of the time the research papers we get do look exactly like this. They don't have an established, or they might not even be quite as strong as this. This has very, very good research that's very well done within it. Sometimes we receive a summary analysis as a research paper that doesn't have a clear thesis, but also maybe doesn't have the basis in research that this has. So we thought this was a good example to present because this is what we typically find as research that is given in maybe as a first-time research paper, as people who have maybe not done a research paper before, but know they have an interest. So we wanted to make sure that this type of example was available, so we could point to the things that are done really, really well and what would need to change to make this into an actual research paper that gains better score based on the rubric. And Ibrahim's note is that people will sometimes repurpose things in order to enter a competition. So if an item was being made and wasn't finished, that is correct. That is correct. So let's say that you decide that you've been making these socks, but you're not going to finish them. So now this is a research assignment. Well, changes must be made. It's not the same documentation in order to pivot in that way. All right, so let's move on to investigation. And we're going to start getting a little bit tight on time, so we're not going to spend as much time on each of these sections. I'm going to have you just very quickly either read ahead rather than have me read to you super slowly. I'll give you kind of the cliff notes of the investigation in case you do not want to read or read slower. As example, one in lacing styles, the investigation involved looking an initial examination of paintings in several periods and observing whether there was symmetrical or asymmetrical lacing in place. At the same time, looking through different catalogs, museum, trying to capture as many of those paintings as possible. All in all, this artisan looked at 500 paintings to come up with a group that actually showed clear lacing of symmetrical or asymmetrical fashion that they then analyzed very carefully to make sure that they were seeing what they thought we were seeing. So it wasn't a cursory, I'm just going to look through these paintings. There was some really in-depth analysis done as the paintings were compiled, as they were studied, and as it was cataloged. If you followed the link into this documentation, the ways in which that data was parsed and sliced and analyzed in different ways to give context was actually quite extensive. So when we look at what type of investigation score we might give it, let's start with the evidence. So 5,000 initial pictures, 500 additional pictures were looked at from a pool of 5,500 were chosen. Of those, just a little over 100, I believe, had visible lacing. and those were analyzed in depth. So where do we put this initial score for evidence for this particular example? So we have 5, the artist had good criteria and focused their investigation. Anything else? We have there's a lot of evidence, but it's only one type of source, a 4 or 5. Anyone else have thoughts? 4. So 4 would have been data, example, and facts begin to build a coherent body of evidence. We actually were feeling very generous that day. We gave it a 5. And we gave it a 5 because of the different ways. We have 5, I'd call it a solid body just from the number of sources. Yeah, we looked at the number of sources and also the way they were analyzed. So when you're looking at a painting, you can look at a painting and say that's spiral lacing, end of story. But there was a lot more work done. And if you look into the documentation, something that's not required of any documentation or research is charts and graphs and all of those things. However, this particular documentation used those tools to very strong effect. So we saw many different ways in which we could chart symmetrical, asymmetrical, or undetermined types of lacings that appeared in those paintings. And because of all of the different ways that the data was presented, you started feeling like you actually knew something about how this was happening in period, which is, of course, the goal of any investigation is to kind of provide that feeling to the reader that they know something that they didn't know before. The second section, arguments and research methodology. Do we feel like their methodology for research or the arguments that they have made, are they something that's not, are their conjectures not based in evidence, or do we have a good basis of evidence and logic? Where do we find that for part 2 of our investigation score? Did the argument, did they talk about gaps? They did not. They did not actually talk about any gaps that they had in their research. They did talk a little bit about places that it was undetermined. The primary conjecture of the piece was, of course, that the information that we normally would have, that most historic lacing would have been asymmetrical, was not true. That was the primary conjecture, and most of the analysis did back up that conjecture. So what we gave that is, on the day of judging, we gave it a 5. We felt that the method, but both A and B, the method of inquiry and the data were well thought out and explained. And we thought the methodology was actually quite good. How the paintings were selected, how they were analyzed, and how that information was then presented into some cohesive whole. The interesting thing is that we actually thought that there was very high scholarship in this particular area, but then we got to part 3, further avenues for further exploration. Where do we think we put judging for that in this paper?
Right. Now, they're fairly big, so we don't want to drag them along even as we, but we should find a place to.
Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know how big is this carrot? When I look at the map, like, is there
the paper did not mention any. You are correct, Ibrahim. Absolutely no. The artist was asked, and the artist said, yeah, no, this was very narrow scope. I didn't give it any thought at all.
Less than you, more than
and we ended up giving it a 2. in this category, mostly because when something has done such a good job, I mean, it's very, very hard. It's almost as hard to get a 1 on the rubric as it is to get a 6. Because at some point, it is easier to support someone and help them do better by giving them a 2 than it is by giving them the 1. Sometimes the 1 is just where you are. But if it's close, if you're on the line, you're going to lean towards a 2 rather than a 1. It's very hard to look at things that are very, very well done and then find this giant hole and decide, it gets a 1. So we did give it a 2, though, because there was just nothing there. Upon further poking, we could get the artisan to admit that, yes, they could see where they could have gone into XYZ direction, but the artisan really didn't want to do that. That was an area where any further avenues were not presented in the documentation in the paper itself because the artist didn't have interest in that specifically. So that was a missed opportunity on the artist's part, which she freely admitted.
And so just one other comment. I think this also shows again why it's important for judges to really do everything they can to talk to the entrant and try to get the answers out of them, because many times they're in there somewhere. It can be very hard to remember to put everything in the documentation. There's so many things to think about. So we really are hoping that the judges will do their best job to really support the artisan in giving the answers that they might have.
Absolutely. And I think, we're very focused today because our 2 examples are written research on a research project as a written paper, but that's not a requirement. You could present your entire research verbally. The writing isn't the point. The research is the point. The going through the process of the research is the point. So a lot of the things that a judge can do is to, even when it's a written paper, facilitate that discussion so that there's a little bit more of a back and forth between the artisan and the judge. All right, moving on. So as we discussed earlier, presentation is really about how well something flows. So if you have a moment, I want you to just take a quick look at both of our examples. Again, you don't have to read them from start to finish. We have the Cliff Notes. We're going to tell you what happened. And just go ahead and take a look at how we think the paper flows. And both of these papers are written in different styles. One of them uses a lot of graphics embedded. The other one uses a chart in a different point of the paper. Neither of those are requirements of research paper. As we said, it's not even required that it be written as a format. But I'll get you to the Cliff Notes at the end very quickly. Both of these presentations scored 5s in both categories for how well written, understood, and clear the research work was. For all of for the faults that we named earlier about having a thesis or a stated argument at the beginning, we found really no faults in the research itself and how well it flowed. What we would say is that we didn't there was no temptation to bump any of these into a 6 because nothing made us go, wow. And I think the beginning of wow for a research paper would have had to include a thesis at the beginning. So that is what we thought about presentation. Sources for these are fun, and we're getting close on the hour for our research part of the rubric. So as we only looked at example 1 for our investigation portion, I want to look at example 2 for our sources. So when we look at example 2, what we saw was a lot of names that if you're not familiar with Nobildonna or Coptic stitch, you might never have seen these names. I had never seen these names. Many of these documents don't necessarily read as being strong authoritative documents. So the first one is private correspondence. It is at a museum, so that it has that in its favor. There are some articles. Looks like there's an article that's presented in an anthology, and you start wondering, how are the writers selected for this anthology? Are they reputable writers? How was this assembled? Is it graduate students that were looped into putting chapters in a book, or are these actually people who might know? And you know, ideally, in any given panel, you would have an area expert who would look at these names and say, "Oh yeah, I know who Dorothy Burnham is, and I know exactly who Boris Virenque is." Perhaps, but let's just say there isn't a expert in this particular area, either because this area is something that a lot of people aren't working in, or just because the pool of judges on that day didn't happen to include someone who could judge that with specialized knowledge.
Well, I'm
so the way we looked at it is we looked at the sources themselves, and we looked at how they were cited.
Following them.
And what we found as we looked at the sources was, you know, we just don't know. There's a variety of of sources. We don't know which ones are direct and which ones are analytical, really. There's I guess, a good quantity of sources. I don't know how applicable these sources are, and I definitely don't know what the authority of these sources are. So as judges, we got stuck. So we had speculation, and all of our speculation started with the words, well, if we were able to speak with Ibrahim, we would, and go on and on and on. But we didn't actually have him present that day. So I was actually able to speak with Ibrahim today. And so what we know after speaking to the artisan is that one of the pioneers in this type of research is on this list. And the people that are here are people who are in the finds, that are doing the research with those original documents, that are really they have their hands in the game at primary and high analytical level. So now we have a context for what those particular sources are, but as we go through them, we then have to decide, are they good sources? Are they a good variety? Or have they been clearly established? Or are we higher or lower than that? So where do we think we grade it? We have a 4 coming in. Some of these are very old sources. I'd be curious to hear the stories behind those. And museum catalogs, yeah.
Why don't we do a wilderness?
And I will say, Amelie, that had you been on the phone with Ibrahim and I earlier today, you would have heard some of the stories behind this, because what we discovered with this artisan is that very knowledgeable and very excited about the knowledge, about the research. When you pressed play, a lot more information came out. So these were 3 categories under sources that we had as a 4, a 3, and a 3, and it became 3 4s based on the conversation with the artisan. Because it then became not unclear, not maybe inappropriate, or not established. It became, no, these are all good. Go ahead.
So one idea I'll encourage, but it's not at all required, is if you want your sources to be able to speak to your audience for themselves, one thing I like to do is do a small little annotation to each of my source entries, just describing what its authority is. Like, say, this is the premier investigator of this type of arts and crafts. They're a professor at the school, etc. This was done after they did a study or an archaeological dig. That can save your judges time by allowing them to get that idea of expertise without having to ask you. What it is also really useful for, though, is anybody else looking at your research and looking at your sources who might want to decide, I want to follow up on this research. Which of these sources should I start with? You talking about the quality of your sources and what they do and who the authors are can help that investigation.
Magic bags and is teleportation a thing? I mean,
I like that idea, actually, the kind of little annotated bibliography, just to kind of help things move along. And again, this is where we're focusing on a written format, mostly because everybody has a bias to the format that they would like to employ. Somebody might feel that they would rather do an oral presentation for all of their research. It is, for some people, daunting to think of trying to remember everything. For some people, that's not a challenge. They could, in fact, give their research in a much more authoritative, detailed way if they presented orally, whereas the prospect of writing down physical documentation might make them feel slightly ill. So you have to know for yourself what the right format is, and it might be that some hybrid format is the right place for you to be. So just keep that in mind as you're coming at your research. We want to see a quality of research. We want to see a good thesis. We want to see a lovely investigation that makes us all curious and excited, because we're all geeks here. But it doesn't have to be one format or another. And, I keep saying written and verbal, but there might be a totally different format I'm not thinking about right now that would work beautifully. So if you have questions and are creative in that way, let us know. Far be it from me to say that there's not some wonderful, somebody's going to come up with some beautiful video presentation that's going to be awesome, Video
presentation, poster presentation. You can tell stories with those things as well.
Absolutely. All right, so that is our little dive into the research rubric. I do invite you to look at the handout and the documentation deeper, especially if you had any questions about any of the particular areas, because it'll give you also a little bit more context for maybe how the judges that came up with our scores on the back end came up with what we came up with. So we tried to really put ourselves into the place of what would we do if we were approaching this cold. So I hope you, wish you a lot of fun with that, and hope that you will spend a little time investigating the rubric. And we're going to put Research Rubric aside for a minute and jump to our Performance Rubric. And in our Performance Rubric, we only have one example, and we're going to have a lot of fun here. So before we begin, it's useful to mention that the offering that we have today, which happens to be Baby Fiore's documentation from a 2007 entry, this was entered in the Outlands, and the Outlands at the time was not using a rubric, and most certainly not this one. So one of the things that could have been helpful, and that would certainly be of service to an artisan who's entering our competition in performance, is to think of putting their offering in a way that's more cohesive for the rubric.
Roll your D1.
So when you look at the Performance Rubric, I am going to be looking at it shortly. It is again set up so that we are reading it from left to right. A lot of these aspects are the same from rubric to rubric. So although there's some specialized language, I'm not going to read the whole thing again. But the first thing we find is similar to general rubric. We're encountering the challenge of the rubric to start with. So if I was doing this document now to submit to performance, I would go through and write, this was the challenge, or at least not, maybe I don't use the word challenge, but put all that right on top. And then move on to what is the historical context, maybe in my second and third or third and fourth paragraphs. And then move on to, this is the part about my performance creation. This is how I did it. And then maybe put the translation in that gap that will be the execution, how I actually do it. This is a song performance. And then finally, put the sources together. Have some sort of flow that keeps the judges from having to hop around your documentation, trying to figure out what you did, which, bless them, my friends in the MIS office did, is hop around and try to figure out the format from where there was no format. So as you're looking at that link, keep that in mind, that there was no observation of this particular rubric as this was created. All right, so challenge. When we're looking at challenge, we're looking at what was the challenge to this artisan. So it's not necessarily about whether this was hard in general or whether this was at a level that someone expects to be difficult. It's more about what was it specific to this artisan. So was it hard for them? Did they learn something new? Did they stretch themselves in any way? And it's important to note, and Lena loves to mention, that this is a great place for newer artisans to really shine, to show how they extended themselves forward, to show what they learned, to show these very beginning steps, which when you're first starting at a class, when you're first starting at a art, you're taking these baby steps, but they all feel like giant leaps and giant things that you're diving into. So there's a lot of really wonderful ability to obtain points for that type of work, for really showing your journey in this challenge area. For advanced artisans as well, but I think for newer artisans, this is a very kind of happy place in terms of how your project comes together. Then we have our historical context, and this is how well it's connected to a specific time or place. And who would have done this? How was it done? Those types of logistical things about a given work of art. Like, where does it fall within the scope of our game? Then we're looking at performance and creation. And I'm going to look very awkward while I pick up the rubric that I dropped with my feet. Ooh, YouTube, hello. All right, so performance creation, we're looking at how did this employ maybe historic language or historic methods? What tools were used? What movements were used? I mean, any number of things that are specific to how this particular work of art was created. What substitutions were made? Like, what did you have to do differently? And how did you explain or handle or justify those particular substitutions or changes? What is the evidence supporting the information that you're putting forward? How are you saying? You say this is how we employ the historic language. Okay, how do you know? All of those things. So where did you get the information? What is the evidence? And also, what is the evidence and knowledge of the appropriate performance practice and or creation practice for this work of art? So what do we know? What can we know? What conjectures have you made? Where are you taking this performance based on the historical context that you have already put forward in the document? And this is where we start to really deviate from what might be Bardic. So in the Bardic arts, we have many people who are performing period appropriate things, and they're doing it beautifully, and they're working really hard to make sure that their 14th century chanson is just impeccably the height of what that can be. but they're not necessarily having to then come back and
That's fine. Yep,
document
that's fine.
their
That's fine.
evidence, their process, the way they explored the language, the way they thought about gesture and dress, all of the things that are usually for the artisan, the behind the scenes. In performance arts and science, we actually bring that forward. So what happens behind the curtain is now on display. So when we look at then the execution, we're looking at how did all of this actually happen in the moment? What is the level of skill, the ability, or technique? What does the performance meet the artisan's goals? What they actually set forward as what they wanted to do? How are mistakes or limitations in research and or methodology addressed? How can the knowledge gained here in this particular performance inform future projects? So that's how we're looking at the execution. And we have an example, so we'll get into it. And then sources. Again, the sources are divided into variety, quality, and applicability and authority of those sources. This should sound really familiar at this point because this is a uniting point across all of the rubrics. Looking again at the combination of direct analytical sources that are used, how are we referring to them, looking at how they come together, and taking all of that to all the fun places that knowledge can take us. All right, so let's get into our example, shall we? So our example is Amarilli Mia Bella, and there is a link to the documentation there. Under the challenge, our artisan stated, the piece I am presenting today is Amarilli Mia Bella, published in Le Nuove Musique of 1602. The manuscript of this work clearly separates the syllables so that the word stress is clear and the integrity of the language is maintained. This is important as Giovanni Bardi stressed to Caccini that singers of this time were regularly sacrificing communication for their own virtuosity. The manuscript provides a simple accompaniment and also notes appropriate harmonies, likely so that any ornamentation a performer would choose would follow the harmonic structure of the ancient Greeks. In his preface to the Le Nuove Musique, Caccini gives very specific instructions for the ornamentation of his songs. His instructions are almost a direct quote from the letter sent to him by Giovanni Bardi on appropriate performance practices. Since the performance of the works was as important to the camerata as the composition of them, it is important to clearly understand their intent. In my presentation of the piece, I have chosen to use very little ornamentation and focus instead on the clear delivery of the text, emotional communication through the piece, and letting the harmonic line of the piece, as written by Caccini, come forward. This choice is informed by my understanding of Giovanni Bardi's disdain for the ego of the Italian singer of this time. He felt that the song and its message were far more important than the voice that delivered it. All right, so let's look at our challenge area and how we might grade, score this particular piece. So when we're looking at this first category, under the degree of time, research, or creativity and commitment that's required, in order for us to know what that meant to the artisan, we have to go further than the information that the artisan has so far provided. So the artisan, upon being questioned by Mr. Selena Hilton about why they are doing this particular project and how difficult this project was, the artisan stated that they were interested in doing this music because they hadn't actually attempted an early music piece. They were interested in trying a conjecture that was going to hopefully take them forward. They did quite a bit of research that was considered sophisticated by the judges, that being the advanced use of library materials, finding obscure sources, among them including a facsimile copy of the manuscript, which in 2007 was not available online. So actually library diving had to be done.
So much better.
But this did not pose a challenge to this artisan. The artisan had just graduated from a master's degree in voice performance, had just spent 6 years of academic research behind them in conservatory programs, and had just finished their dissertation. So she was completely comfortable with that line of inquiry. So while on the whole, it sounded impressive, for this artisan, that was not a challenge. The artisan was trying to push back their normal vocal production. They had determined a specific conjecture that they wanted to explore that was physically difficult to produce. There was some physical work that had to be done in order to put forward the conjecture that they were coming up with, and they described in detail, which we'll be going into in detail when we get to performance creation, what they were going to do, and that part of the challenge was considered very difficult to them. So as we're looking at the degree of time, research, creativity, and commitment, where do we think we find, okay, I feel I need more information. What about? What questions would you ask?
You actually gave it, because I was thinking that I didn't know kind of anything about the artisan or their experience with any of this. So having that information helped. For me, I think maybe 4s seem right.
Yeah, does anybody else have anything else? It's okay if you don't. I'll just jump ahead and say we actually gave it a 3 for the first category. The work demonstrates a moderate degree of time, research, creativity, and/or commitment, simply because the artisan was really, really good at all of the stuff that seems really, really hard about this project. We did give it a 4 under the goals force the artisan to expand their comfort zone relating to either their skills or knowledge of topic, because their conjecture involved a physical change to the way they produce sound. And project poses a new or interesting challenge for the artisan under 4 as well. So we went with 3, 4, 4 under that first area for challenge. Again, this is a very personal thing. That level of research for another artisan might have been very, very hard. We might have looked at that level of research in an artisan that was not used to doing that type of research and called it a 5. But again, challenge is specific to the artisan.
It's an obscenity.
All right, so then we go to historical context. And in historical context, I'll go back into the document.
2 heads.
From about 1573 to 1592, Giovanni Bardi invited scholars to discourse about literature and sciences, history, and specifically music and the theater as performed in ancient Greeks. These meetings often included presentations of new works of poetry and music. In about 1577, letters began to focus on Greek music and performance. May believed that the reason Greek music was so effective and emotionally powerful was that it focused on a single melody and clear delivery of the text. He also discussed in his letters the nuances of rhythm, melodic line, and registration in these works. These letters were read and debated at length at the Camerata meetings. Maestro Galilei concurred with May and wrote a treatise attacking the practice of vocal counterpoint, which was popular throughout Italy at the time in the multi-voiced madrigal. Many discussions by correspondence occurred on the subject between Giovanni Bardi, Giulio Caccini, who was Bardi's star pupil, and Galilei. They also began creating compositions based on the scales discovered from ancient Greece. Count Bardi excelled in the writing of music and text in this new style of music. He also helped codify the new music by defining and redefining the concepts in correspondence. At times, Bardi simply reworded Caccini or Galilei's previous correspondence as if to be clear that they were on the same page. A clip that did not make it here is there was description of the Florentine Camerata and the names of all of these men who were member of it, which was a group of the Camerata of Florence. So I realized when I took the clip, I missed that little bit of context. So when we look at historical context then, do we have a connection of this work to a historical time or place? And is the analysis of the historical and cultural context clear? Where do we want to put those things? Time and place are specific. Connection and analysis to the cultural analysis is less detailed. And that's the way we saw it in judging as well. We gave, under historical context, we gave the first part a 5. It builds a pretty solid connection to a time and place. But under historical context and cultural context, we said that there was discussion. We gave it a 4. We said that it was thoughtful. There was insight into probable meanings and values, but it wasn't really solid. That connection was not made in this documentation. So
go
ahead.
Just for a quick question, what would have raised the that 4 to a 5? Because when I'm looking at it, I'm seeing the information about the sort of Greek influence, and I'd love to know a little bit more about that and how that was incorporated into this. Is that what was missing? Are there other things?
Absolutely. So it could have, what would have perhaps elevated the historical context for the historical and cultural context was to actually define that melodic thing. In the title of this piece, I refer to monody, which is, of course, this type of song that has one vocal line and one instrumental line. Monody was named monody in evocation of a Greek song form. And there was space to have spoken about what monody was, why they were trying to recreate the music of the ancient Greeks. As we're talking, I could have talked about why Girolamo May kept talking about ancient Greek texts. As it turned out, he was the preeminent translator of all of the ancient Greek texts. So he had been in all of those original documents in the original Greek. And there was a lot more to get into that. I just didn't think of it. It wasn't within the scope of what I was trying to do. We'll get into that in performance creation, but I think it's not uncommon to say that for performing artists in particular, sometimes our focus is so much on getting the performance to be a certain way that even as we're documenting the historical aspects that are very interesting apart from the actual act of performance, sometimes get lost in the cracks. You know, we're excited about the thing, like, I'm going to sing in 5 minutes. So I think that's a little bit of what happened here. I mean, who cares about the ancient Greeks? I'm going to sing something now. And, you know, not that all artisans were as full of hubris as I was in 2007, but yeah, it was epic. Moving on. So let's get into our performance and creation. So I wrote, in the presentation of the piece, I have chosen to use very little ornamentation and focus instead on the clear delivery of the text, emotional communication through the piece, and letting the harmonic line of the piece, as written by Caccini, come forward. That's repeated from earlier. It's about what Giovanni Bardi's disdain was for the ego of the Italian singer. The active conjecture of the performance of this piece is that my operatically trained voice is likely not appropriate for this style of music, as bone conduction, which is letting the active sound wave travel through the bones of the face and sometimes of the upper body in order to amplify the sound wave. That is what we do when we're doing opera. As bone conduction and vibrato are the distinguishing characteristics of opera, I have worked to decouple my voice production from active bone conduction and have reduced, but not eliminated, my normal vibrato. This process was quite difficult as it involved shaking up some entrenched muscle memory. And after completing this process, my expert ear leads me to believe that this is what I'm hearing in the recordings of this style of early music as performed by specialists in the field. And I footnoted a performance that I really believed I was matching perfectly. So without, talking about how snarky I'm being in performance creation, let's see how we would grade that concept, that process. And we might find that we need more information. Certainly the judges did. So the first one, we're looking at historic language, techniques, movements, or tools. Haha, I agree with lack of details. Yeah, I gave no information really about what I was doing about the historic language. This piece is written in archaic Italian, which required the using of the Zingarelli Vocabolario della Lingua Italiana, which is this gigantic tome that kind of helps you dive into modern Italian, yes, but they have editions going backwards and they have a lot of historic terms. So it was my first journey into learning an archaic version of a language and making sure that I was on the right page. As it turns out, the 16th century is really not that archaic when it comes to Italian. There's spelling differences and a couple of pronunciation differences, but it was not dire. I am fluent in Italian, so, that was not hard. It just was what it was. I did not use the movements that they were starting to develop at the Camerata as stock movements at the time. And in terms of modern things that might have been present in the piece, besides me, there wasn't a lot. I didn't, use a different instrument or try to do anything like that. When we look at substitutions, upon being asked, I was able to recall that I transposed the piece to a different key. I mentioned in the documentation that these monodies were for a single voice, accompanied by an instrument, usually a lute. I sang a cappella, no lute for me. I did not explain the absence of the lute. I just kind of let it go into the ether. In terms of evidence, information being supported by ample evidence applicable to time, takes, and context, and understanding of original performance creation style. Those are the places that things got very interesting, because like many times when you delve into a project from the past, oh, my friends, this is where I got it all very, very wrong. So as I was being asked questions, I indicated that I had found a facsimile of the original manuscript in the music library of the conservatory I was attending at the time. I selected this piece because of its range and length. It was subsequently transposed and I sang it a cappella, although it would have been performed with lute in period. I was not caught on the fact that I had mentioned in a previous paragraph that the accompaniment was there solely to provide some harmonic context for the ornamentation, which in fact had no basis in fact whatsoever. I sort of just assumed that in my brain and put it on paper. Artisan pursued this conjecture about the work would have been performed based on personal observation and their educated, though flawed, opinion. And importantly, any of these points that I was making on paper might have been evident to someone with experience
Why
in
don't you
this
just pick
period,
them for us, eh?
but not necessarily obvious to those without, which is why we really do try to get a judge with subject area knowledge on every panel, just to make it easier for the judging panel in general to get through all of these things.
I think when I'm looking at it, I don't know anything about this particular art, but I am noticing the lack of maybe detailed citations and examples. The documentation kind of gives an overview of what's going on, but not a lot of in-depth evidence sometimes to support its conclusions or its conjectures. So while I have no idea what is right and wrong, that is something that, not knowing this art, I'm able to sort of pick up from the documentation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. I think perhaps when you're, let's say you're adjudicating something with which you don't have a lot of familiarity, that can sometimes make you feel like you're a little locked and like maybe you're not going to be able to do this fully. But there are things that you know, and you can follow the rubric even without knowing necessarily certain things. Because if you come into a wall and you say, I don't see a source, then that's pretty clear. But if you see a source but you don't know if that's a good source, you can ask a question and let the artisan take you over that hump as well. So what we ended up doing in performance creation is we gave the first category, historic language, techniques, movements, or tools, a 4. We gave the substitutions from period practice, once they had been explained, through questioning by Mr. Selena Hilton. Again, if you look at the paper documentation, there's a lot of holes in that written documentation. So that was given a 4. Amelie says there are also assumptions being made about period training, and to the extent to which period singers are being trained, can those be substantiated by any evidence? That's very true. I mean, a lot of conjecture was made about what singer training was in a period of time where we have very little documentation about any singer training. So these are questions that people who are professionals in the field of this historiography, this musicology, don't know. But that was not going to stop me from sailing in an opinion in that particular point in my life. But it is something that probably can't be known. Why did I change the key? For my comfort, for no other reason. I'm a mezzo-soprano, and looking through it, I had selected this piece specifically because it did not require any high-flying singing, and then realized that I would have to sing it in the morning, and made a choice. So when we got into the third and fourth sections of performance and creation, under whether there's support for the information or whether there's understanding of original performance practice or creation style, both of those got a 3. They weren't really bad, but they were really thin. There was a lot of conjecture. There wasn't a lot of evidence given. There was a lot of supposition in that. And I think the artisan, well, baby Fiore at that particular moment was depending very much on their actual performance to coast over any bumps in the evidence about performance practice. As a matter of fact, I feel fairly confident that she never expected to defend the performance practice. She was going to sing Purdy, damn it.
So I have one question. I'm actually going back to the justification for changing the key. Again, I don't know anything about performance really. Is that an appropriate justification? Is it a lazy justification? I just don't know. Should a different work have been chosen?
Here's the thing that there should have been. in some types of music, and in particular what we consider, classical Western music, it is completely appropriate to change keys, but not in all. And I gave no time at all or thought to whether this particular style, whether in monody, they would have been moving keys. Again, I think that the whole shifting of key for my comfort is a symptom of the bigger problem with this project, which is the supposition that my expertise in one style of singing made me an expert in singing.
So in that case, I'm thinking maybe for that particular area here, it could even be lower depending on some conversation. Maybe it's explained and justified, but not appropriate.
Yeah, so interestingly, I tried very hard I was one of the judges judging this work, and I tried very hard for a 2, and Elena and Amelie would not let me do it. Because I frankly, I find the hubris amusing, but a little criminal. So I would have totally given it a 2. Amelie says there's also discussion of period tuning and pitch, which is different than modern tuning, etc. There's a lot of different avenues to explore. She brings up a good point, and these are not things that were mysterious and unknown to baby Fiore. I had just finished a boatload of high-level conservatory education. I just was choosing not to wade too deeply into the things that I was uninterested in, which is all of the parts of this project that did not involve me singing the pretty notes. Yeah, so this is not an example of well-done scholarship. It is why it's being presented here, as a matter of fact. It is a piece that would have done exceptionally well as a bardic entry, perhaps, but it wasn't actually going to be a highly graded performance ANS project, because the actual work into a high level of scholarship and a real understanding of how to show the process of getting a work into the public eye, that was not really fleshed out in any real way. So the documentation that was presented was really cobbled together because it's like, oh, I need documentation? Okay, let's pull some things. All right, does that make sense for people? So I would totally, I will tell you that, well, baby Fiore would have been, heartbroken and, on the diva couch, but a 2 would have been in order, uh, for sure, for those places where just no attempt was made to explain some of these changes that were done. All right, execution. So today, I'm gonna get into this window. So one of the things that I did today was I wanted to give you the experience of having a performance to judge. Interestingly, oh, hold on. Maybe something bad has happened. Hopefully nothing bad has happened. I had a video here.
And if for some reason we can't get it to work, I can link it in the video description too.
All right, I have it, I found it. All right, so I'm going to share a video. I will say that we wanted to have something that you could judge in terms of execution, but it's not possible for me at this point to follow through with the wild conjecture I followed through with in 2007. One, I didn't have the months of trying to bully my voice to stop conducting bone as a matter of course. And then, of course, it's the few intervening years since then in which I have been entrenching my operatic voice even further. So it was not a way that I could create a performance practice that was incorrect in the same way that that particular offering was incorrect, but perhaps this is incorrect in whole new ways that you can judge. So let us share the screen. And oh, wait a second. Can everybody hear that? Can you hear it? Okay, I need to stop share and make sure that my computer audio is being shared. I just forgot that that is an audio setting. Share screen and maybe we do need to link it from the YouTube, because I think that I don't know how to make sure that you can hear the sound of something that's playing from my computer.
We can definitely do that if you just want to talk a little bit about it. We were able to see you in garb and everything for a little bit, though.
All right. So going to have to find the link again. And this is the musical interlude. That was not the song I sang, I promise. There's the link. I will go ahead and put that in the chat as well. But let's try to share it this way and see if it will play in a way that's audible. So here's the link to that in the chat. Let me try to share it from Safari. All right.
It's actually knocked down.
Is that audible yet?
Got a changeling thing. Say win the thing. Same thing. Double check.
Yeah, I think because I don't own the I don't own the Zoom account, so I can't make it get me play my audio from my computer. Oh, wait a second. Wait a second. I just saw a thing. Let me try this again. This might work. Maybe.
Mia bella, non credi del mio cor, dolce desio, d'esser tu, l'amor mio. Credilo poi, e se ti morta sale, dubitar non ti vale. Aprimi il petto e vedrai scritto in cuore Amarili, amarili, amarili. amarilli, amarilli, amore mio amore,
All right, so we have now an execution and we get to grade it. All right, I'm glad we could get the sound to work, so excellent. So for under the first, so we have three categories in the execution. Under the first part, we're trying to see if they demonstrate a basic degree of skill, technique, or artistry, a moderate degree, a good degree, or an advanced degree. Under the second, we're looking at whether the goals of the project have actually been achieved. So those are the artisans' goals that were stated earlier. And then we're looking at the actual mistakes that might have happened in the performance. Are the artistic mistakes acknowledged, not acknowledged? Are any limitations in research or methodology? Is there some speculation for improvement given? Does the artisan have a concrete idea of how the work could inform future projects? We start talking about how the artist concept of how it went goes, not just how it went, but also how does the artisan conceptualize how it went. All right, so where do we think we fall on that?
For the
a little bit of discussion.
For the mistakes, I think a theme of this has been that mistakes weren't really acknowledged, so I don't know that this will get high. I don't see anything in the documentation you gave to us, so unless you want to add something as the artisan.
You know, since we're just giving a performance for giving a performance sake, the baby Fiore would have looked at that, and if my conjecture had been they sang with plenty of vibrato and they probably sang operatically,
Yeah.
If that had been my conjecture, I'd be like, nailed it.
And with the goals, like the one thing I could tell is that I think it had the vibrato. I don't know quality of singing like necessarily otherwise, but I did notice that, and that seemed to not match the ornamentation idea, the lack of ornamentation idea.
The line between that and Mozart, or actually I don't sing Mozart, but the line between that and like one of my bel canto arias, which is 18th century, is really non-existent. There is no line. There is no line between that production, and it's not really about vibrato. Amelie has a point. Vibrato is something that historians fight about a lot. What almost no one is fighting about at this point is that we have done something to the rib cage of an operatically trained singer that we only saw in the castrati of the time. So castrati had these big rib cages, and they like talk about how extended they were and what they did, but they didn't actually talk about female singers having any change to their silhouette. Of course, they were bound and, you know, wearing stays and all sorts of stuff, but I don't know very many operatic singers, not especially singers that sing Verdi or dramatic music, who don't have a, you know, there is nothing I can do to give myself a waist. My rib cage is a tank. So I think that's something that we have established, and, you know, modern me might have talked about that in an A&S project, but baby Fiore would have been like, it's fine, it's all good. But yeah, in terms of execution, the way we scored it, just based on my discussion of what I had done back then, and I tried to make I tried to make the same level of mistakes, although these are different mistakes.
the way we had scored it last time is that under the actual execution, we said that, you know, it demonstrated a degree of skill, a good degree of skill. There's some technique there, there's some artistic ability, but it's only a 4. There's nothing exceptional happening here. It's not really the best that this artisan could do. Under the second portion, whether the goals of the project were achieved, we said that the work achieves many of the goals of the artisan as they are stated. The artisan didn't have very many goals, but I'm going to sing now. Then as we're going further into this last part of the execution, whether artistic mistakes were acknowledged, artistic mistakes were not acknowledged. This would have been a 1, except that Mistress Elena asked point blank if this was the exact type of performance. So having admitted to a mistake, and even baby Fiore would not have lied to someone's face. So had I been asked in 2007, I would have copped to some things that I did not have to cop to. So we gave it a 2 under the mistakes were acknowledged, but absolutely no attempts were made to actually put in any speculation for how this would be improved, or, you know, the entire I think statement was mistakes were made. So yes, that is solidly a 2. You have admitted the mistakes. Having gone no further than admitting mistakes, you take your 2s and you're happy with it, or not, but you still get your 2. So again, it's not, and I think this is an important place to note that the purpose here is not to perform flawlessly. It is not to perform without mistakes. 1, impossible. 2, more stress than you possibly could ever need approaching performance. And 3, that's not the point. The point of performance in general, but especially performance in the ANS, is, can you show us the process of performance? Can you show us how did this fit with what you wanted to do? How did this fit within the greater context of your work? Sure, tell us how you think it went. We'll tell you how we thought it went, but what went wrong? What went wrong? What was it like in the moment as that was going wrong? What are the ways in which you can make that better next time? What were discoveries as you were going through your conjecture that made you go, oh, that's totally wrong. That can't possibly be it. If 2007 Fiore had actually taken a moment to think about how hard it is to decouple a sound wave from bone conduction, she might have had a clue that maybe bone conduction is not exclusive to opera singers, and that perhaps they were doing it in period because the voice wants to vibrate through bone. But no, she did not have that idea, because she had a conjecture and she was sure she was right. So this is one of those places that as you're doing something, sometimes you'll become aware of where something's wrong. And it would have been a much more interesting project if the description had been, I tried this for 7 weeks and oh my God, that was really, really hard to do and really, really uncomfortable. I wonder if, and it could have been a totally different project and a totally different direction that actually would have been not only more interesting, but would have scored much better. One of the notes we're getting here from Amelie is that folks reconstructing these performances in the 80s weren't necessarily right either. That's true. I mean, we've been wrong in many, many different ways over a time period. So when you're listening to recordings of a piece that's written in period, sometimes you can pull a recording from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the aughts and go, is this even the same song? Like, is this the same piece? And the answer is no, they're not. I mean, they are. But our thoughts about performance practice have changed a lot. And for some people, performance practice has never really been a thing. And our assumptions are sometimes built in scholarship and sometimes not. So for our purposes as performance arts and sciences, we want to get as close, like in all of the rubrics, I hope you're getting the feeling, the pull towards the rubric is trying to guide a project to how close can we get to the thing. You know, we're not trying to be perfect. We're not, I'm personally of the opinion that historical accuracy is not a thing, but we want to get historically approximate. We want to get historically adjacent as closely as possible. So that's the goal we're kind of pivoting towards. And so I think that the grades for the execution in particular, the scores for the, I keep saying grades, the scores for the execution in particular, I think denote that there was just not enough done to bring the execution forward. Now, granted, on that day in 2007, this is something that I told Amelie and Elena as we were judging this. On that day, that performance was exceptional. I emptied out an entire, there was a room with fighters, you know, minding their own business. I emptied out their room. They came to see what the ruckus was about. You know, it was glorious. I felt like a goddess. It was fabulous. It was wrong. It was wrong, wrong, wrong. So this isn't about whether it's beautiful or enjoyable or whether it entertained people. That's great, but that's not necessarily what the rubric is looking for, right? All right, so then we're gonna wrap this up and we're gonna go over by just a few minutes, so my apologies. Sources, and I'm gonna speed through this. So you see the sources within the document. There really just should be more of them, especially scholarly sources. At the time in 2007, as we mentioned before, the artisan was just completed with a very high level conservatory education. They had access to more scholarly sources. So the sources overall were good, but they're not excellent. The artisan was able to verbally defend the authority of their sources, but it isn't established in the document itself. And this is where we got into a little trouble, because the artisan was able to talk at length about all of the aspects of the Florentine Camerata, about the monody, about all of these different parts of it that were available to them. But the artisan did not list where they learned what they were saying. I was able to discuss to Ms. Selena and to the High Lady Amelie all of these points of information that I would have known in 2007, been able to orally tell my judges. However, I obtained that knowledge from sources that I did not put in this bibliography. And there is a name for that. It's plagiarism. No good, my friends. Don't do it. Not even in the SCA, not even for fun. So that's just, you know, my PSA. You sometimes just don't think about it because I didn't put it in my paper. They're not in my bibliography. But now here I am talking for 20 minutes using knowledge I obtained from sources that are not actually being cited. Not fair to those very wonderful authors. Amelie will notice that my primary sources that are listed are excellent, but the secondary sources are really lacking. So this is where we gave it scores that are in line with that. We ended up giving it a 3 for this first portion. I closed my rubric sheet too soon. We gave it a 3 under the variety of sources, of direct analytical sources. We say it's fair. In terms of quality of sources, it was given a 4. The sources are generally good. And in terms of applicability and authority of the sources as they were stated, I was able to defend who these people were and what their level of scholarship was in terms of the things that I used in the actual documentation. I tried to establish them, but I did speak to that as well as the judges asked me questions. this was a very painful project for the judges to score, because they had to interrogate the artisan about many, many points that were not actually in the documentation. So as an artisan, when you're creating your work, especially for performance, not neglecting that part of it so that your judges can actually have the benefit of understanding your project within context in a way that is clear in your document, or even in your presentation if you decide not to write a document, so that it stands alone as a strong component absent the performance. So I think where in Bardic the performance is the thing, here the performance is a component of the thing. It doesn't stand alone. It has to stand with your actual research and with the structure that you've created for it. All right.
And
So
Amelie had an interesting point just to add it. An exploration of more secondary sources might have helped illuminate the theory about bone conduction, etc. So just having that analysis behind your conjecture would have helped.
absolutely. I think when we're performing anything, the temptation is to think about, how is my voice going to respond? How is my body going to respond? How is the, whatever the gesture of performance it happens to be, how is that actually going to function? Is such a big part of being a performer. I have to warm up. I have to learn the piece, the pitches and rhythms. I have to make sure I sound great, or that my movements are great, or if I'm doing a dance thing, I have to make sure the steps are in order and I remember the choreography. All of that is important, and it's fiddly, and it's where we get nervous. So then we forget that there's an entire structure around it when you do A&S performance, which is, again, a different animal than performing in other parts of the SCA. But I think the beauty of it is that you can stretch in the aspects of performance, something that you're thinking, okay, maybe that's going to be a stage piece that I want to do for Bardic, or a dance piece that I want to present elsewhere, or a story that I want to do in this location. But I'm going to do the research now. I'm going to dive into the performance practice now. I'm going to show my creation of that work now as an A&S project rather than just as a performance. So I think there is something to be said for creating both avenues of work in making yourself kind of a well-rounded, not just an artist who performs, but an artisan who performs. All right, and my apologies, we have gone a little bit over, but that is all I have for tonight. Are there any questions? We have Stephanie here today, so I don't know if you have any questions. If you do, if you can ask them now, or you can pop in at a later time, or just send us an email. It's kind of always hard to get to the end of the class and and be for those questions. Are there any other comments you think we should add, Lissa, before we call it a night?
I think we are good. So I'm gonna stop the recording now, and thank you very much for doing this.
You're very welcome. Have a good night, everyone.
Well, that's